What's up, everybody? Welcome back to my channel. Sorry I made the other one hella long for no reason. Please excuse. I will try to make this faster. But, your boy talks a lot. Anyway, alright, let me get into it. Okay, everybody? So we left off on the last video, and I was talking about, what it was like in the different parts of the New World, depending on the European powers and how, like, what happened with the natives that were living in the places that were eventually conquered and colonized, right? So we talked about the Spanish. That was a big one, right? But now I want to talk specifically about the United States and what was going on, or what would become the United States and what was going on there. So the first American colony, as in American United States, the first permanent one was established in 1607 in Jamestown, Virginia, okay, by the British, right? It was established by a company called the Virginia Company, and they were there actually looking for gold. They didn't find any gold in Virginia, right, but they found that the land was really good for growing crops, especially tobacco, so they stuck around, okay? Jamestown actually wasn't the first British colony in what would become the United States. It was actually Roanoke Island, and that's an interesting one because Roanoke was an island off the coast of Virginia, where a few hundred British colonists went, and they lived there for about 3 years, I want to say, a few years, and eventually they all vanished. They all disappeared with no trace, and to this day, hundreds of years later, nobody knows what happened to the original colonists at Roanoke. Okay, it's a mystery. They're gone. They just disappeared without a trace. Maybe on like Halloween we'll do something with that because that's a really interesting, spooky story. Anyway, so we got 1607, right? Jamestown. Okay, and this brings us to our first, right, really popular, important Native American figure, which is Pocahontas. You guys might have watched the movie, the Disney Channel movie, right? But more likely than not, you're familiar with Pocahontas. Okay, well, Pocahontas was a real woman, right? She was a real lady that lived in Virginia at the time. Okay, she was the son of a native chief. Okay, and she was born into her tribe, right? And eventually, right, she was about 12 or 13 years old when the British came and started taking land from the natives that were living there. Okay, after a while, right, she ended up marrying in a British man. Okay, and she was then taken to the New World. She converted to Christianity, and she got a new name. She named herself, or they named her. I'm not entirely sure. Rebecca. All right, and she was brought to England and Europe. And the reason she was brought there is so that the British, who were trying to colonize the New World, right? So they wanted to show her off as like, oh, look at what we can do with the native people. Like we can like put them in fancy clothes, and we can convert them to Christianity and teach them English and like help them and stuff, like not to be what they are, right? Because remember when we talked about, right, the misconception that people had at the time, and unfortunately still times to today, that they thought that natives were savages and uneducated and couldn't do anything on their own, and they needed the Europeans to come in and help them. So they tried to use Pocahontas as an example of that, okay, in order to try and secure funds from royalty so that they can further conquer the land, which, I mean, clearly ended up working, right? But the story of Pocahontas is really sad, actually. She had one son, right, and around the age of 20 or 21, while she was still being paraded around England, she ended up dying before she ever made it back to her home in Virginia. So, real thing that happened, right? So, an interesting thing to talk about is, like, like, does the Disney Channel movie and what people know about Pocahontas, does that, like, accurately portray the life that she lived? So, we can talk more about that later, but we're going to go ahead and move on, okay? So now I want to specifically talk about the Potawatomi tribe, okay? And the reason I want to talk about them in specific is because they are the last natives to have lived where we live today in Chicago. All right. So, in a little bit of a broader sense, what happens when the British come to the New World? Okay, their initial goal, right, was to get rid of them. Okay, so there was instances of using natives as slaves, right, at the time. However, most of the time, the British really just wanted to push them off of their lands, move them from their lands, and take over their lands, right? To be used to settle and to farm, etc. Right? So that was really the policy, right? Is they would go to a place, they would fight the natives, and same thing that happened with the Spanish, right? Disease, superior weapons, etc. Right? And eventually, right, the natives were pushed further and further away from their lands. Okay, well, fast forward to American independence, and we get the United States, right, gets independence from Britain, right, becomes the United States of America, 1796. All right, and now we have the United States dealing with Native Americans rather than the British. Okay, but the United States kept that same policy going. Right, we know that the United States kept expanding from the original 13 colonies west, right? So eventually, right, the United States took lands in the Midwest, right, like Ohio, Michigan, in the South, right, Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, Florida, etc., right? And the further they moved west, right, they encountered different groups of Native Americans. Very similar things happened with them where they were removed from their land forcibly, right, and pushed further and further west, right, to now we have reservations, right? So reservations are instituted by the federal government, right, and their land set aside for natives, okay? And the thing about the reservations is that they set these reservations thousands of miles away from the natives' original homeland, right, and usually on land that was like not really wanted by anybody else, right? So a lot of land in Oklahoma, a lot of land in places like in Arizona, right, where you can't really grow, it's not really great, not very fertile, right, and thousands of miles away from their actual homeland, that's where these natives started to be relocated to, so that white Americans could come in and settle in their former lands. Okay, so we have the Potawatomi, and they lived in the Great Lakes region, right, and at the time of the founding of Chicago, they lived on around the southern part of Lake Michigan, all the way from Detroit, right, all the way to central Illinois, almost central Illinois, and all the way up into Wisconsin. They were also in Indiana and parts of Ohio as well too. So the Potawatomi, they were a part of a confederation of 3 tribes, all right, and they they began to encounter more and more of an American presence in their lands, specifically because of Chicago, right? So what does that look like for us, right? So the very first presence of American government in Chicago was Fort Dearborn. So Fort Dearborn was a small military fort, okay? At this point, you have to remember also Illinois was not the Illinois that we know today. It really was like nothing but open land, open prairie. It was totally frontier. There was no really like cities and things like that we have today. It was pretty open land, right? I mean, obviously the natives were living on that land, okay, but there was no real like cities and structures and urban things like that, right? So at this point, it was an outpost, okay. It was a small fort, right? But as a result, right, more and more Americans started moving to the Fort Dearborn area that would eventually become Chicago, right, and started encroaching on Potawatomi lands. They would start, and a series of treaties were signed that were starting to cut up pieces and parts of Potawatomi land, right? Well, eventually they got fed up, and that leads us to what we know as the Battle of Fort Dearborn, okay, which is we're gonna see this. I'm gonna put that later, okay. So the Battle of Fort Dearborn, right? It was a Potawatomi. They attacked the fort, right, in order to try and get rid of the United States government military that was stationed there, right? So they attacked the fort as a surprise attack, right? And they ended up winning that battle, right? They ended up killing and capturing a lot of the people that were living there, right? A few of them did manage to escape, right, with help from Black Partridge, who was a Potawatomi chief. He took some women and children and hid them away and saved them. He was rewarded for that, as well as a few other ones as well, a few other native chiefs. Okay, but right. So as a result of this, so they ended up winning. However, the American government decided to use this instance, right? So they named this the Fort Dearborn massacre. Okay, and they used this to justify really like kicking up this expansion, right? So they start coming in, right, and they buy up this land through these different kinds of treaties. You can see here, Illinois, all these different tracts of land are from different treaties, right? And they start really kicking out the natives that were living there, the Potawatomis, right? So that brings us to the Trail of Death. So the Trail of Death, right, you can see here, there's our Potawatomi lands, right? So the Potawatomis, and specifically a band that was in northern Indiana, right? They were forced to walk on foot from their native homelands south of Lake Michigan all the way to reservations in Iowa, Kansas, and Oklahoma. All right. So as a result, hundreds of them died. Right. They were forced to walk on foot thousands of miles away. Okay. By gunpoint. Okay. And this includes women, children, the sick, right, etc. Okay. So this was not great. Not good times at all. All right. And they were forced to relocate to these other lands that frankly nobody really wanted to live on at the time, right? So this really cleared the way, literally cleared the people that were living there for Americans to come in and settle, and they did, right? So as a result of this, right, we get cities like Chicago, like Milwaukee, all right, Detroit, all right, the places where we live today. This is where they really get their start now that the native presence has been removed. Okay, now that they can come in and build these places. All right. The important thing to remember about the Potawatomis is that they, like other native tribes, have not disappeared. All right, they are still here. They still have a presence. Right. Obviously, not unfortunately not in Chicago, which was one of their native homelands. Right, but in other places like Kansas, Oklahoma, and in Michigan as well too. Okay, so they're still around. Right, they're still getting together. Their language is still alive. Right, so it's important that we remember that they are not just right banished to the history books. They're not like an ancient people that are we just talk about like they're no longer around. They still are today, and they still have ties to this land. Okay, that's down there. My bad. Okay, and let me see also. Oh, there's a lot of videos. I'm gonna put them in there separate. Okay, but so that's really where I want us to end off. Okay, we're gonna continue talking about this more, right? And like I said in the beginning of the other video, we will be practicing our skill of claim building using what we have learned about Native Americans and their history in the New World and in the United States, and specifically here in Chicago. Okay, so yeah, and that's gonna be it. All right. Thanks for listening. You guys are lit. I will talk to you soon.